Good afternoon, attendees of this colloquium. I am Abigail Payne, the Ronald Henderson Professor and Director of the Melbourne Institute, Applied Economic and Social Research in the Faculty of Business and Economics. Let me extend a warm welcome to each and every one of you. Let me also acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea, and community. We pay our respects to their elders past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. Today's colloquium features our research that has been undertaken in Indonesia. I would like to extend my welcome to those joining us from this country. Let me note that for this colloquium, we have arranged for an interpreter for those who do not speak English. If you plan to listen in English, you will want to select the off option on the interpretation menu. If you are connected to the colloquium using your mobile phone, you will need to select the More button if you want to change your selection of interpretation. If you are listening and watching this colloquium through Slido, there is no option for interpretation. These colloquia replace our normal face-to-face forums and workshops. Our goal is to provide insights through the lens of Melbourne Institute researchers and to engage with you so we can better understand Australian economic and social policy. We view Australian economic and social policy as one that is inclusive of our neighbors in the Asia Pacific. Today, our researchers, Dr. Deanna Contreras Suarez and Professor Lisa Cameron, will be presenting their work on the effects of child marriage on women and men in Indonesia. This research is a collaboration with Mampu, a joint initiative by the governments of Australia and Indonesia. Lisa Cameron is a professorial research fellow and coordinator of disadvantage and well-being in the Asia Pacific program. Her research involves studies in Australia and in developing countries. Her work focuses on analyses of poverty and well-being, economic development, maternal and child health, and evaluations of social welfare programs and gender inequality. Deanna Contreras Suarez is a research fellow with the Institute. Her research is focused on development economics, where she uses statistics to understand matters such as cash transfers, child development, family and maternal health, gender inequality, and disability, which have been developed in conjunction with the governments of Australia, Colombia, and Indonesia. Lisa and Deanna will speak for approximately 20 minutes. This will be followed by a few questions, and then Ms. Santi Kusumaningrum, the director of Puskapa Center on Child Protection and Wellbeing, will speak briefly to provide her insights and reactions to the presentation. Santi engages in work that focuses on safety and well-being on a range of systems and services in Indonesia. Her work helps to inform actions and policy. She also undertakes evaluations of programs that have been implemented. Please let me remind you of a few housekeeping matters. This colloquium is being recorded. To handle questions and comments, we are relying on the Q&A function found at the bottom of your screen for those of you using Zoom. For those of you using Slido, you can submit questions in the box on the right-hand side of your screen. You can submit questions at any time through these functions. Please join me in welcoming our speakers.
So thanks, Abigail. As Abigail mentioned, this is a collaboration between Mampu and the Melbourne Institute. And at the Melbourne Institute, I was working with Deanna, who will also be speaking today, and our colleague Susan. So there have been some important recent policy initiatives in Indonesia. Probably the most important of those is the raising of the legal age of marriage for women. It was raised from 16 to 19 years of age in September last year. So it's now at parity with that for the legal age of marriage for men. Indonesia's National Midterm Development Plan has also enshrined a target for reducing the prevalence of child marriage. They're aiming to reduce it from 11.2% to 8.7% by 2024. And the government has also developed a national strategy on the prevention of child marriage. So child marriage is common in Indonesia. About 29% of Indonesian women were married before the age of 19, and about 8.4% of Indonesian men were married before that age. That translates into about 25 million women being married before the age of 19 and about 7 million men. What we're doing today is we're focusing on the consequences of child marriage, and we're building on important work that has been done previously by others, including Santi from Puskapa, who's our discussant today, working with UNICEF and the Indonesian Statistical Agency. They looked at the drivers of child marriage. It's important to understand the drivers of child marriage if you're seeking to reduce the prevalence of child marriage, but it's also important to understand the consequences of child marriage, to build a case for change, to drive and motivate the implementation of the recent change to the marriage law, which is going to be implemented at the local level. So it's important for district officials to understand the consequences and why it's important to reduce child marriage. It's also important for families to understand the consequences of deciding to marry a child at an early age. So I'm going to speak briefly about the data and methods, and then I'm going to pass to Deanna to discuss the results. So the data we use in this study is the Indonesian Family Life Survey, or the IFLS, and it's a really rich source of data. It's a longitudinal survey starting in 1993, which surveyed Indonesian households right through to 2014, and it's ongoing. And so it's perfect for studying the consequences of child marriage, because you can observe a woman getting married and then follow her through time to look at the consequences of that early marriage on her outcomes through her life. And we also use the IFLS East, which includes some eastern provinces which weren't included in the IFL itself. So by pairing these two data sources, both IFLSs, we end up with a data source that is broadly representative of the Indonesian population. Another thing to note about our study is that we go to great lengths to separate cause from correlation. So other studies have looked at the differences in outcomes of women who married at an early age and those who married at a later age. But we know from the work on drivers of child marriage that women who marry at an early age, and men for that, and men also, that early marriage is associated with higher rates of poverty. So if you compare someone who married at an early age with somebody who married later in life, you're not comparing like with like, because you're most likely comparing somebody who's poorer than the other person. And so then any difference in those outcomes could reflect poverty status rather than child marriage. So to get closer to causation and not just looking at associations between child marriage and outcomes, we use statistical techniques to control for the characteristics of the woman or the man and their households. So we can control for demographic characteristics, we control for childhood socioeconomic status by including the father's education as one of our control variables, and we also include geographic fixed effects. And that's just a term that means that we're controlling for the fixed characteristics of the community in which the woman lives. And we include these down to the village level. And then in some specifications, we also include sibling fixed effects. So that means that effectively then we're identifying the impact of child marriage from a comparison of a woman who got married at an early age with the woman who got married with her sister who got married at a later age. And so because the sisters have shared the same kind of household, they're affected by the same household characteristics, that comparison allows you to be more certain that you're identifying the impact of child marriage. So we'll now turn to the results. I'm just going to introduce the first set of results, which is looking at years of education. And I'm just going to spend a bit of time explaining the figures because we're going to be presenting a few of these figures, and so you need to be able to understand what they're showing. So if you look at the figure for women on the left, you focus on the blue bar, you can see that that's showing you the average years of education for women who were not married at an early age. So on average, women who weren't married at an early age have 10 years of education. And then most of our focus in this talk is going to be on the orange bars. The orange bars show us the impact of child marriage. So that orange bar for women, that the height of that bar is 1.6 units. And so that's indicating that child marriage has the impact of child marriage is to lower women's education by 1.6 years. And the result for men is very similar. If you look at the graph on the right, at the orange bar on the right, you see the height of that bar is 1.8 units. So on average, men who get married early end up with 1.8 years less education than men who do not marry at an early age. So now I'll pass to Deanna to take us through the results.
Thank you. So from here, I will continue to show you the results over a different set of indicators, and I'm going to start with the results around employment. So for women, we find that they have worse labor market outcomes. And we start by presenting the results in terms of labor force participation. So for those who don't know what that means, labor force participation is the proportion of people who report working either for a pay or also doing unpaid work. So this statistic would capture when people say that they were working in the previous week. And what we find is that female labor force participation for women who were not married as girls, approximately 66% of them are married. And for those who were married as girls, they will participate in a lower extent. And the difference is, while it's still small, 2 percentage points, this statistic is significantly different, which is this little bar over here. Then when we look at the type of jobs that they hold, we found that they are less likely to have a formal sector employment, and the difference is 12 percentage points. And we also find that they are gonna earn less money. So on average, they will have a 26% less payment per hour worked. When we look at men, we find that their labor force participation is just slightly higher, 1 percentage point. However, keep in mind that the labor force participation for men in Indonesia is already really high. So around 95% of men will work or participate in the labor market. Now, when we look at the formal sector and the payment that they receive, we find a similar story than what we found for women. They are less likely to have a formal job, and they are also gonna get less paid, around 18% less pay. So this means that men and women who get married early will have lower quality of employment, and that means that they are gonna be losing the benefits of having a formal job, and they are also gonna get a lower pay. And this will translate, in fact, on their households having a lower income per capita. Then we'll find child marriage has negative consequences on marriage quality. So in fact, we find that the quality of marriage matches are lower for men and for women who married early. So women who married early were about 60% more likely to get divorced. And similar for men who married early were more than 50% likely to get divorced. We also find that women have less say in a decision-making index that includes items like whether to use contraception, when to make large expenditures, how much money do they get saved, and other type of important decisions that are made within the households. For men, we find a similar picture, which is comparing to those men who didn't get married as boys. Men are also less likely to have a say in household decisions. For those women, we also find that they are less likely to have a marriage certificate, and their children are less likely to have a birth certificate. And what that means is that not having those documents, it's a limiting factor for them to access public provided services, like, for example, access to hospitals or healthcare. Then we move on to look at the effects of child marriage on fertility and the health of the mother and the children. And most of the indicators that we present here are the ones that the literature has identified as risk factors for maternal and child health. One of the factors associated to complications during delivery and the risk of maternal death is the age of delivery and also the number of times that the woman is exposed to this risk, which means if it's related to the number of deliveries that she has. And what we observe in this graph at the top is that those women who were married as girls are gonna have their first delivery at an earlier age. So they are on average 3.5 years younger when they have their first baby in comparison to those women who married later. And also they are gonna have more children, which means that they are gonna have more exposure to those risk factors. In addition, they also have less antenatal care. So they have fewer antenatal checkups. They are less likely to take iron supplements while they are pregnant. They're less likely to have a blood test while they are pregnant. Their babies are less likely to have a heartbeat checked. And also they are less likely to be medically supervised during birth. And this is also associated to higher risk of maternal death. While in this study in particular, we cannot evaluate the effect of child marriage on maternal mortality, in a previous collaboration that we did with MAMPU, we found that one of the most important drivers of maternal mortality in Indonesia was the lack of access to appropriate care when complications during delivery arise, which is just telling us that those women who marry early are going to be more at risk of facing this type of complications. We also examine what is the effect of child marriage, not only in the women, but also in their kids. And the first thing we found is that their kids are 50% more likely to die under the age of 5. And this is in comparison to the children who are born to a woman who was not married as a girl. And this figure is showing that this pattern is true for all women in Indonesia, those who are living in urban areas and those who are living in rural areas. For the children who survive, they will have poorer health status. So while we find that they are more likely to be underweight, this difference is not statistically significant, but we found that they are 10%, they are 10% more likely to be stunted. And also when doing a cognitive development test, they tend to perform worse. And those two differences are significant. So stunting, it's a measure that of long-term health, and also low cognitive development during childhood has been shown to lead to poorer outcomes later in life. This is, for example, performing poorer at school, having lower earnings when the person is an adult, and also having poorer health when the person is an adult. Which means that child marriage does not only have a negative effect on the women and the men who are exposed to it, but also that their children have negative consequences from it. And those consequences for the children are likely to last until their adulthood. This means that child marriage has an intergenerational effect that are related to poverty. The final indicator we wanted to show was to compare how men and women perceive their lives as a whole. So for that, we constructed a standardized index with questions where people are asked about the adequacy of their family life, the standard of living, the food consumption, access to healthcare and children education. And based on that, we constructed that index. And when we compare women and men also to those women and men who didn't get married early, we found that in both cases, the difference is quite large. It's almost one entire standard deviation, which just basically says that the negative effects of child marriage are not only in economic and educational dimensions, but also in terms of having a negative effect on life satisfaction. One result we wanted to present is what happened when children marry children. So during the consultation process last year in Jakarta, we met with several organizations who are working on this topic of child marriage. And a recurrent topic that arose from those conversations was that it's not necessarily the case that young girls marry to older men, but also that younger girls were pressurized to marry their teenage boyfriends. And then what we wanted to do was to look at what happened to those type of marriages. So what happened when children married children? And the way we did that was by comparing girls who got married to young boys versus those girls who got married to older men. What we is that the disadvantages that we presented before are actually exacerbated for both partners when both partners are children at the time of marriage. So in particular, we found that those women are going to end up with even lower levels of education, and they are also going to have more children, which is going to generate like all these implications that I just explained before. However, we found that they are less likely to divorce, and they are also more likely to have a better share in decision making within their households. So in summary, we found that child marriage has negative consequences on education, on employment, income, the health status of the mother, the health of the children at their education, family structure, and the overall perception of life satisfaction. And we also found that this is even worse when children marry children. Now, the $1 million question is, what can be done to prevent child marriage from happening in order to avoid the negative consequences that I just presented? And now I will pass back to Lisa, who is going to talk about the policy implications of our research.
Thanks, Deanna. Can I have the next slide? So Indonesia has made a good start by legislating to raise the legal age of marriage for women. However, research shows that the changes to laws are unlikely to be sufficient, and additional measures will be needed to increase the benefits of the existing policy. So I'm going to take you through a couple of examples of policies that have been tried elsewhere. So there's a program that provided vocational training and life skills to young girls that was implemented in Uganda. This program provided girls with vocational skills to enable them to start a small-scale income-generating activity. And it also provided life skills to help them make more informed decisions about sex, reproduction, and marriage. And this program, fortunately for us, was rigorously evaluated. And 4 years after the program started, girls who participated in the program were less likely to have been pregnant as a teenager. They were found to be less likely to have got married or to be living with a partner. They aspired to get married at an older age. They aspired to start childbearing at an older age. And they were also more likely to be engaged in income-generating activities, and so to be able to provide for themselves and be independent. But this was a very successful example of deferring child marriage through the provision of skills. A policy that took a different approach was one that provided financial incentives. This was in the context of Bangladesh. This program provided unmarried 15-year-old girls with a financial incentive in the form of free cooking oil on the condition that they remained single until they reached the age of 18. So it was a conditional cash transfer program, or actually it wasn't cash, but a conditional transfer program. And this was also rigorously evaluated. And the program was found to have reduced the probability of child marriage by 23%. The probability of giving birth before the age of 20 also decreased. And girls who participated in the program were more likely, on average 24% more likely, to be enrolled in education at the age of 24. So this was also a successful attempt to reduce child marriage. The last example I'm going to go through is one of information campaigns. So child marriage is a cultural phenomenon and it's embedded in social norms. And social norms are notoriously difficult to change, but they're not impossible to change. And so various programs have found that social norms can be influenced by direct information campaigns, such as print, TV, or social media campaigns. And what's been found to be effective in these information campaigns is that they're much more effective if they're tailored to the local level. So they involve local leaders or social influencers or people that other people are willing to listen to, take advice from, and respect. So we're going to leave it there, so we've got enough time for questions. Thank you everyone for coming, particularly those, well, for those in Australia and in Indonesia and elsewhere. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Lisa, and thank you, Deanna. We have time for a couple questions before we turn over to Santi. Lisa and Deanna, if you can turn on your video, that would be great, as well as you can unmute. So the first question I have is actually in terms of thinking about the policies, you focused on 2 studies that focused on the girls, and then you talked about 1 study that focused on kind of changing in culture. I was wondering if anybody has explored influences on the parents of the children, and to what extent parents can be influenced in terms of nurturing their children not to engage in the child marriage.
So, I mean, I think there's a lot of scope for engaging parents, because often parents are the decision makers in this situation. And the financial incentives program in Bangladesh, it provided the free cooking oil. And that free cooking oil was provided to the girls. The girls were the ones that had to go and pick up the free cooking oil. But it was actually kind of the rationale behind that was that it was an incentive for the parents. It was saving the parents money and providing a financial payment to the household. So trying to kind of engage the parents in the program in that way. So that is an element that was successful in that program. I'm not aware of any that target parents more directly than that. I don't know if you are, Deanna.
No.
As a moderator, I get to ask the difficult questions. The second question I'll ask, and then we'll move to Santi, is in your, because you have such a rich data set, and you talked about using village fixed effects, have you explored whether or not there are differences of the implementation of the law across villages? So kind of getting more at this cultural norm that may exist within villages, and trying to tackle the cultural norm.
The reason we could have done, so the reason we didn't do that is because the change of the law didn't happen until later. So that was in 2019, and our data finishes in 2014. Therefore, it's just prior this that we wouldn't be able to explore that. But it's just, we would like to do it in the future once the IFLS next round happens. And then we will be able to actually explore that and how it's implemented and how it just will capture, the differences of how it is implemented.
Okay, great. Thank you. We're now going to turn to Santi for her reactions and comments. Santi will speak for approximately 5 minutes, and then we will come back to a second round of question and answers. So thank you, Santi.
Thank you, Abigail. And thank you, Lisa and Deanna, for sharing this study with us today. I guess thank you for helping us understand that child marriage happened to both girls and boys, but the share was bigger among girls, and the negative consequences of early marriage were borne more by women and girls. That being said, I guess the insights about the impact of early marriage for men are important too. This study leads us toward better understanding of causes beyond correlates, and that is very important. Above all, I guess personally, I appreciate that this study provides an important support to the global notion that when women marry later, they would earn better and safer and have a higher chance to participate in public roles. And anecdotally, as we know it, institutions and countries seem to be doing better when they are led by more women. This evidence confirms that child marriage is happening and harmful. Unfortunately, I guess my reaction is that we know all too well that knowing something is bad doesn't automatically lead to an action to stop it. So studies like this can help convince people to do something about child marriage when it is turned into a policy proposal that shows how is it preventable. And it is where evidence like yours needs to be accompanied by an understanding of drivers as they provide insights about what to do and where to start. Resources are always limited, and we have to make sure that their allocation is informed by good evidence. The implementation of the National Strategy on Child Marriage Prevention in Indonesia, as you said, can definitely consider the study's overview about the successful programs in other countries that Lisa just presented in the last part of their presentation. Next is, I'd like to make a comment about, I fully agree that changing the law is never enough. Sometimes making something illegal, like in this case to marry before the age of 19, has unintended consequences. The hassle of going to court to petition for a marriage dispensation could be a disincentive, but not in a way we would hope it would. As indicated in this study, and also from our own Puskapa's years of research, there's still a huge gap in marriage registration in Indonesia. The lack of marriage certificates contributes to children being unregistered, as Diana mentioned. So these vital registration deficiencies have prevented individuals without documentation from accessing basic services, protection, and later on economic opportunities. At the same time, our population data continues to suffer from inaccuracies. Despite it being an important political gesture, I think we need to make sure that the new law doesn't push early marriage away from the public eye, making them more hidden and less registered. We need to make sure to continue to monitor this. Next is, I think, implementation science needs to be embedded in development programs such as Mampu, or the ones that will follow Mampu, that will come after Mampu. So interventions can be designed based on contextual problems, and knowledge at the same time can be generated not only about what works and what doesn't, but about why and how one works in a particular localities while others don't. This is an arena where political economy analysis is also important. We need development programs to invest in longitudinal studies like IFLS that look into resilience in its broad sense. Studies that follow the same individuals since birth to explore what makes them emerge from the same adversities, and instead of marrying early, end up making different decisions in their life. We need to learn from more success stories, but in a way that it allows a population-based understanding and causalities discovery like this one, beyond documentation of good practices. Lastly, I invite everyone, and I think because we need science to look more into the granular matters, like children's agency, how children make decisions, and social norms that are associated with it. Recognizing children's agency doesn't mean we're blaming children, or that children are fully responsible for what seems to be a consent they gave. We cannot really say that it is a full consent when children don't know the risk of marrying too early, and more importantly, when children don't know that they have other options available for them. This last point is, to say the least, complex. I'd like to end my reaction, Abigail, by noting that to prevent child marriage from happening and to mitigate the risk for those who were married when they're minors, we have to be willing to have difficult conversations. They are political as much as they are technical. At the end of the day, child marriage to me is a representation of social options we construct for children. And in Indonesia, those options are morally charged. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Santi. Now let me invite Santi, if you can keep your video on, and Deanna and Lisa, if you can join us. We will have another round of questioning. So let me first start with a question about the richness of the data set that you all can study. So will you be able to identify the key determinants of child marriage? In particular, will you be able to disentangle the effect of poverty versus social norms versus other factors?
So I think Santi might be the one to answer that, because Santi has done work on drivers, which we've just drawn on.
Okay, so I think the data sets that we have now, Abigail, and Lisa might also know this very well, is very limited in understanding social norms in its true sense, because I think we need separate, different specialized studies to understand social norms. And it is to really understand what do children think other people do in situations like they're in when, being encountered to an option of marriage, while they're children? And also, what do they think people expect they do? And this requires a lot of different sets of questions, and I think a different kind of approach to the data collection itself. Unfortunately, we do not have anything like that at the moment, although this is an invitation for Lisa and Diana to start thinking about designing such studies, which I think is very important.
Okay, great. Next question is, with respect to child marriage, can you look at household size? So the question is, may parents, quote, sacrifice one child so that they can invest in the human capital of another child? And if so, how does this relate to notions around fertility and family size?
Would you like to answer that, Diana?
Yeah, well, we didn't specifically look at the effects of, like, what was the household composition difference between those households where child marriage was coming from those who were not. And the only thing that we did to that is relatively related to this is like where we're trying to look at if, for example, was the oldest child the one who were getting married, if you can think of that as the idea of the oldest child is sacrificed so that they can invest better in the second one. And we didn't find any kind of systematic patterns on the negative effects of child marriage. So while we didn't look at it directly, we didn't find evidence on the things that we look that could be the case.
Okay, great. Now, the next question is two parts. One, there were a couple questions around, have you done anything to think about or study the availability or use of contraception among girls in child marriage, as well as thinking about immunization for the children born from the child marriage couple?
So I'll start with vaccination, immunisation first, because that is something that we've looked at since we finished the report. So it's not in the report, but we have gone back and looked at that data, and we do find that early marriage results in the children having lower vaccination rates. So that's something that we will incorporate when we seek to publish this paper in an academic outlet. On contraception, now we do have rich data in the IFLS on contraception, but as far as I'm aware, and you chip in, Deanna, in case I've forgotten, because we've looked at a lot of outcomes, we haven't looked at that, and that would be something that would be that's a very good suggestion, and we should look at that.
Yeah.
And
one thing that we look at related to contraception was when we were looking at the indices on household decision making, and one of the ones that would greatly come up in that breakup was the indicator of if the woman has a say on whether she takes contraception or not. And so we saw that, but we haven't looked at that particular item further than that.
Yeah. And I saw that in the chat, so this might preempt one of the other questions. Susan Sawyer was asking whether, was talking about contraception as a policy tool, in that if you make contraception more widely available, then girls aren't going to become pregnant, or less likely to become pregnant when they're not married, and less likely to be pressured into marriage. And I think that's a very important point, and something that we could incorporate in the policy section.
Mm-hmm. And that's where the difficult conversations begin.
Yes.
Yes, as an American, I know not to touch that question. So there are about 3 questions that are focused on geography. So essentially, if I kind of combine the 3 questions, folks want to know, are there geographical variations in your findings? They want to know if there are urban and rural differences. And, essentially, what can you think about in terms of, I think this is probably getting into this notion of the villages, the role of the village, the role of differences in culture that across the country that may play a role. But tie it specifically to geography.
Mm-hmm. So there certainly are large differences across Indonesia. And when we went to Jakarta and spoke with a lot of knowledgeable people in this area, we were encouraged to look at particular ethnic groups with particular customs and particular provinces. And we went back very excited to do that. However, when we looked at the data, although we have a large number of observations, once you start cutting it down and looking at specific provinces and specific, well, ethnic groups in particular, you just lose a lot of statistical power. So in the end, we didn't end up doing that. But I think that's an area that's worthy of a much closer research. We also did look at urban and rural differences, and the prevalence of child marriage is higher in rural areas. And we did originally do all the analysis separately for urban and rural areas. But at the end of the day, we found that the consequences didn't actually differ that much by urban and rural. So we grouped it all together. I think an exception to that was the labour market outcomes, where the labour market's quite different in urban areas than rural areas.
So this may be a question that Sante may be able to answer. So one of the questions is, have the results of the study been presented to policymakers in Indonesia? And if so, what's their reaction and any sense of where they might want to move in terms of future policies?
Well, not that I know of. Lisa and Diana probably know this better, but I think, again, because I believe in this, so I don't like this analogy of putting different hats, so like researcher hat, policy practitioner hat, advocate hat. So I'd like to see it as a crown we wear, Lisa, with like multiple spikes. And I guess a good evidence like this need to be strategically presented to the right policymakers, and I think we are more than open to collaborate in pursuing that as well, and to make sure that it then leads to something effective and measurable. Yeah.
And I'll just add that, so this is part of our dissemination efforts, but we have, the whole project was conducted in close collaboration with various government ministries, including Bappenas, the National Planning Agency, and the Ministry of Women's Empowerment. And so, and we know those agencies are very keen to see action on the ground. So, so we're keen to do whatever we can to assist in those efforts. And it'd be great to work with Puskapa.
Okay, so here's a different twist on question is, what do you think about children who are under the age of 18 who prefer to get married soon because they want to escape their existing family situation?
I'll take this one. I have strong feelings about it. So I think that comes to that point I made around children's agency, Abigail. I think maybe I'd like to also invite my colleagues who associate their work with child protection and child rights and women's rights to start and sort of deconstruct their own ideas about children's not having agency when it comes to their sort of sexuality and also options to explore their sexuality and curiosity as well. In countries like Indonesia, I'm afraid, the only legal and sort of morally supported option to do that is by getting married. So I think unless we start to open conversation around this as well, we will not be able to find an answer or even to understand why some children want to get married when they're still very young. And to me, I guess this is not about them giving their full consent, because again, I think consent needs to be looked at whether children know the risks, because I don't think they do, and whether they know that there are other options available for them. And I don't think they are available unless, especially when managing this sort of natural curiosity and wanting to date and wanting to explore this side of life and not having other options rather than getting married.
Okay, great. So unfortunately, we are out of time, even though we have lots more interesting questions. I will promise you that our speakers have agreed to answer the questions, and these will be posted on the website, as well as you will be sent a list of the questions and answers. Let me thank our speakers and you, the audience. Let me also mention that Lisa and Deanna have written a research insight which has or shortly will be published on the Melbourne Institute website, as well as they will be having working papers and other items that you can read of theirs. Some folks have been asking about wanting to read your work. So I hope you enjoyed this colloquium, and I look forward to seeing you at our next colloquium, which will be on October 6th. On October 6th, Professor Mark Wooden will be presenting on the topic of insecure forms of employment. So thank you very much, and I hope to see you again at our next event.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.